I'm going to have to ask y'all to bear with me. Of all the weeks of the year to be sick, I decided to choose this one. And so I've had a bad cold, and I am medicated this morning, so if I seem a little spacey, you'll know why. But at any rate, it can be a little nerve-wracking to be up here in front of everybody and speaking, so I thought we'd start today by letting you guys talk to me a little bit. We're going to have a little quiz. I have a song with lyrics in it, and I want you to fill in the blanks, and it should be a song that you know. When the dog bites, when the bee stings, when I'm feeling sad, I simply remember, and then I don't feel so bad. I know you recognize that. It's from The Sound of Music, and it's Maria's song that she sings to the children. And you know the character of Maria is so positive. She's so outgoing. Everything is good. She can be scolded. She can be told no, and she just figures out a way to make it happen anyway. And when she sings that song, all of the children end up piled on her bed, and they are grumpy, whiny, angry children, aren't they? But by the time the song is over, they're all singing with her and laughing, and it's all good, right? And Maria, she uses that positive outlook to get through all these difficult situations in the movie, and it ends with discovered love, and the children have healed relationship with their father, and they even escape from Nazi Germany. You know, that's happily ever after, isn't it? But real life isn't like that so much, is it? In fact, it's rather complicated. We're going to be looking today at the book of Philippians, and we're particularly Philippians 4 and verse 8. But I think it's very important for us to understand the context of what is happening in this book, where Paul is coming from as he writes this book, because it gives a whole lot of depth and meaning to what he has to say. You know, you take somebody's advice much better from somebody who's been through it than somebody who has no clue what you're talking about. And so I want us to look at that for a minute. Paul has been in prison in Rome for several years when he writes the book of Philippians, and he's there waiting to appear before Caesar. Now, the Caesar at this point in time is Nero, and you know Nero was no friend to Christians, so Paul doesn't even know what his fate's going to be. Is he going to live or die through this experience? And he's not there for any crime that he's actually committed. He's there because he's been accused of a crime. And all of this takes place in Acts 21. This is where the starting point of the story happens. And he's there in Acts 21, and the Jews accuse him of defiling the temple. They say, you've taken a Greek into the temple, and that's a capital offense. You don't take Greeks into the Jewish temple. But the thing is, they never saw him take somebody into the temple who wasn't supposed to be there. Instead, they see him walking around the city with this Ephesian man whose name is Trophimus. And they gather their opinions, their assumptions on this, and they decide to accuse him of actually taking Trophimus into the temple. So they get so riled up over this situation and so upset that they go into the temple and they drag him out, and they're beating him with every intention to kill him. Now, the commander, the Roman commander in the city, hears the ruckus going on, and he sends soldiers out to see what's going on there. The soldiers get there, and they pull Paul out from the crowd. Now, they don't assume that he's innocent because they bind him, but they pull him away from the crowd, and the Roman commander says, okay, tell me what's happening here. And the people, again, they just get so worked up that you can't even tell what's happening, but they get in frenzy mode again. And the soldiers have to pick Paul up and actually physically remove him from the scene. This is where the book of Philippians comes from. You start in this point in time, and you take it all the way to prison in Rome. Okay, so Paul has endured during this time. He's been unjustly put in prison. He's almost been scourged. There's a second attempt on his life. He's transferred to Herod's Praetorium in Caesarea, where he's subjected to several more interrogations, and all of this is for nothing. He sits there all this time. He's heard by all these people, and yet there's never a verdict that comes down. There's no sentencing. He just sits there and waits. And so he appeals to Caesar at this point. Put yourself in Paul's shoes for just a minute while we're thinking about this. How would you feel if you'd been unjustly accused of something you didn't do, and you're put in prison as a result of it? Would you be angry? Would you be scared, bitter? And then you just sit there. Nothing happens. You just sit there and wait. I think I alone would really struggle with this. But at this point, Paul appeals to Caesar and he's sent to Rome. And the journey to Rome is full of struggle. You know, he has the terrible storm that they go through, which causes a shipwreck. They land on an island and he's bitten by a venomous snake, which, you know, should have been deadly. So this trip is just, what else could go wrong? Finally, though, he gets to Rome. And when he gets there, things start to seem a little bit better. He's still in prison. He's still under arrest, but he doesn't have to be in prison. He's under house arrest at this point. He's still in chains. He still has guards, but he's not in some dank, dark hole in a first century prison. So that looks better, right? And he has the opportunity to do what he loves to do. He gets to preach the gospel to anybody who will come and hear him. In fact, Philippians 1:12-13 tells us that the whole palace guard is aware of his bonds in Christ. Do you know how many people the palace guard consists of? A Praetorian guard is 10,000 soldiers, and they knew about his situation, and they knew what he was preaching and teaching. And in fact, Philippians 4:22 indicates that there are now Christians in Caesar's household. That's the influence that Paul is having. So things do seem like they're looking up, but as life often does, the other shoe drops. And what begins to happen next is the Christians in Rome turn against Paul. His very own brethren decide that they're not so happy with him at this point. Paul says in chapter 1, verse 15 and 16, "Some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill. The one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds." You see, his brethren are out to hurt him. And I had to do a little research on this. I wanted to understand this better. And Wayne Jackson addresses it. These are his words. "Unfortunately, some members of the Roman congregation apparently did not like the notoriety Paul had generated. They were characterized by envy, a feeling of displeasure caused by the success of Paul, and strife, selfish ambition. Fueled by these base attitudes, this renegade group went forth preaching Christ, but the content of their message, it didn't warrant censure, but rather it was their motives that elicited the apostles' rebuke. They were insincere and pretentious. What was their goal? Incredibly, they hoped to raise up affliction for the already burdened Paul. It is not difficult to imagine a scenario. They might have proclaimed that Jesus Christ is king, a point very sensitive to the Roman authorities. When interrogated by the officials, these antagonists might well have suggested, well, you can take this matter up with Paul, the prisoner. He's the most prominent leader of our movement. Can anything else more wicked be imagined? So you see what's happening here is the brethren, they're jealous of Paul. And so they go out and they preach the message, and they preach it correctly, but their attitude is wrong. And when they get questioned about it by the authorities, they're pointing, oh, you go talk to Paul, just making things harder for him. After all that he's been through, his own brethren are turning against him. Have you ever felt betrayed by your brethren? That's pretty difficult, isn't it? Now, I bring all this up about Paul because I think in spite of everything he's been through, we see the book of Philippians come out of it. And Philippians is known as a book of joy and contentment and gratitude. And instead of complaining and feeling sorry for himself, he chooses to look for the good in all of it. I wouldn't do so well. I have stresses that pale in comparison to what he's dealing with. And I cry and I worry and I wring my hands, you know. But what I need to be doing instead is to look at Philippians. It'll teach me how to have that better attitude. It encourages me to evangelize in spite of fear, how to face difficult situations, how to face difficult people, how to face my worries, and even how to face death. Philippians 4:8 reads, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things." So whatsoever things are lovely, that's our topic. What does that mean? What does lovely mean? Lovely is that which attracts the love of others. It is benevolent qualities. It evokes a response of love. It's endearing. Now, don't confuse the word lovely with the word beautiful. Sometimes we put those two words and we use them interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. You know, a snake can be beautiful, but how many of you find it endearing? Wayne Jackson described it well in reference to our scripture when he said, when one thinks on things that are spiritually lovely, it will be so reflected in his personal conduct that it will elicit love from others. I think that's an excellent description for our topic today. What we think about affects our behavior. The Bible teaches that idea in Proverbs 23:7. I bet you can say it too. For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. When I looked up Philippians 4:8 in the commentaries and the lectureship books, Brother Jackson's comment was about the only thing I could find on this topic. There was very little information or discussion, and especially when you get to the phrase, whatsoever things are lovely, there's almost nothing there. A lot of times they would kind of gloss over it with the idea of, well, think about nice things. Okay. Well, based on the lack of information, you might think that this is a topic that's not that important, or maybe it's just self-explanatory. And it is easy to understand the words, isn't it? But it's so much harder to put it into practice. How often do you find yourself in a gripey, negative, discouraged thought pattern? And it's really easy to get down in that place and really hard to get out of it sometimes. We become hard on our friends, we become hard on our family, we become hard on ourselves when we get like this. So we need to learn how to fight this kind of negativity, because it is a command. Think on whatsoever things are lovely. Before we get into training ourselves how to think lovely thoughts, though, I want us to talk about what is not lovely thinking. Keep in mind, our thoughts show through our actions. So as we discuss behavior, it is a direct reflection of our thinking. You know the saying, pretty is as pretty does? I was in Walmart not too long ago. That's a wonderful place to see lovely action. And I was standing in the return aisle, which is maybe even lovelier. But I was standing there in line waiting, and this little boy walks up to the cashier, and he's got shoes in his hand. Now, he has no parent with him. He has no receipt. He has no tags. He has nothing with him to show anything about these shoes, just the shoes. And she stops what she's doing with another customer and answers his question and tells him there's not much she can do to help him. And he walks away. And about that time, it's my turn to go up to the counter. And as I do, here comes a very angry woman who is just cussing and talking loudly. And she's the boy's mother. And she's just going off on the cashier. You think she's going to go over the counter just about. Well, of course, what does this bring out of the cashier? She's going to get angry, and she gets mad, and there's kind of a yelling match going on right there, and I'm kind of thinking, I don't need to be in the middle of these two people the way things are these days. But it was clear that neither of these women had been trained to think the best of others or how to treat other people the way they want to be treated. There was no thinking, lovely or otherwise, happening here. They're just reacting. What kind of loveliness do you see in traffic? You see ugly thoughts being exhibited all the time without any words through people's motions and their actions. And what about Facebook? I know Facebook gets a bad rap sometimes, but it's an easy place for people to just let it all flow out. And they say things, and I don't know if people think they're just anonymous on Facebook because, we're not looking at each other face to face or what it is, but it just comes out there sometimes. I know of a Christian woman who posted on Facebook something that happened in her house. She had a repairman come out to fix the refrigerator. And when he got there, she told him what was wrong with the refrigerator, and he said, oh no, that can't possibly be what's wrong with it. That just doesn't happen. And he treated her, at least she felt like he treated her like she was this stupid little woman. And it made her mad. And I understand that. That would make me mad too. But here's what gets me about it. She got on Facebook, and she starts bragging about how ugly she was to him. How she told him off, and she just continues the story saying that the repairman had to leave to go get a part and he was going to come back later, and how that was a good thing because then her husband would be home and he could hold her back. She said that, and we live in a time where behaving and thinking and acting lovely, those aren't valued actions, but rather it's an I showed them mentality. Don't treat people as bad as they are. Treat them as good as you are. We used to teach children to be the bigger person. I saw another post by a Christian woman with a picture of Jason Momoa. Now, I don't know if you know who he is. He's the actor in the new Aquaman movie, and he's what a lot of women would consider a good-looking man. But in this picture on Facebook, he had no shirt on. And a Christian friend of mine posted this, and the caption underneath it says, "Moms be like, I'll take you to see Aquaman." Now, that is not lovely, and it certainly does not endear you to your husband. How does that make him feel when you go on about another man like that? And it's not pure thinking either. Another Christian continually posts rants on Facebook about what's wrong with everyone and everything, and yet another woman blasts anyone who disagrees with her by calling them names and cussing at them. None of these women are endearing. Y'all might wonder about my friends. But they don't draw you to them. And they don't draw you to the Lord either. Now, those are extreme examples that I'm giving there. So let's bring it a little closer to home. Let's take it into our house. Do you find yourself complaining a lot? Do you talk about your problems all of the time and you never talk about your blessings? Children of Israel had this problem, didn't they? You know, they just over and over and over again, they complained, I don't like this food. We had better things to eat in Egypt. There's not enough water. We're just wandering around here. We should have stayed in Egypt. We just need to die. We just need to be done with it. And God finally had enough, and he punished them for it. He sent serpents to destroy them. 1 Corinthians 10:10 says, neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. This is talking about the children of Israel. He destroyed them for their complaining. Things were different for them. There's no doubt. Change is hard. It always has been. But they failed to think on the good things, on the blessings that they had, and the blessing that was promised them. They were going to the promised land, and God was going to hand it over to them. But they could not focus on that. All they could think was how hard this was. And isn't that still true today? Life is ever changing. It's always hard, and yet we have a promised land that God's going to give to us. So where does our mind go when things are hard? Does it go to your struggles, or does it go to your blessings? And how does your thinking affect your home life? You know the phrases, happy wife, happy life. If mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. There's truth to those statements. Do you resent your household responsibilities? Do you ever think to yourself, well, he can take the garbage out and he can do the dishes. I've been at home with the kids all day, or I've been working all day too. Do we have that kind of attitude towards him? Do our thoughts come out in the voice of a nag? Proverbs 21:9 says, better to dwell in the corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house. Do your actions toward your husband reflect the way you think of him? Of course they do. Make sure your thoughts of him show respect, love, and honor. Now, I know some women are going to say, well, you don't know my husband. He's impossible. He's difficult. He's not nice to me. Abigail was married to a pretty difficult man. 1 Samuel 25:3 says he was churlish and evil in his doings. We don't use the word churlish today, but do you know what it means? He was mean. He was a mean man. And yet that same verse says Abigail was a woman of good understanding. Now, I don't read a daily account of their marriage, but you know it had to have been difficult. And Abigail still found it within her to do the right thing and to think lovely thoughts. So if you are married to this man, take your cue from 1 Peter 3:1. Wives, likewise be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word be won by the conversation or conduct of the wives. And what about our children? What do we express to them when we're always exasperated, we're always stressed out, we're depressed? Well, first of all, we're teaching them that that's how to approach life. And then we teach them that the Christian life isn't the happiest life. And maybe we're even telling them that they don't bring us that much joy. A merry heart doeth good like medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones. Proverbs 17:22. Our thinking affects our behavior as we deal with the world. It affects our behavior at home. So naturally, it's going to affect our spiritual life as well. Paul, in spite of the difficult circumstances that he was in, he still taught the gospel. He even taught it to people who were going to be antagonistic to it. But how often do we say, oh, I could never get up and teach somebody something? Not because we might be persecuted for it or be thrown in prison for it, but just because we're scared of it or we don't want to do the work that it takes to prepare those lessons. You know, Moses was afraid to speak, and he said to God, he said, I can't do this, Lord. You need to send somebody else. But God provided him just what he needed to get the job done. And once Moses got over his own negative thinking, he was really good at it. And I'm not saying either that you have to jump in the deep end of the pool or that everybody has to do the same thing, but you got to work on whatever you can make happen in this regard. But the fearful shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, Revelation 21:8. How much of what we can't do for the Lord just comes down to our mindset. Here comes Sister Jones. She's going to ask me to lead a prayer in class. I don't want to do that. I've been guilty of that. Prideful thinking sometimes keeps us from letting other people do the job. You know, I might think to myself, well, the 2- and 3-year-olds, that's my class, and nobody else can teach it because I have a system. And somebody comes in here, they're going to mess up my system, they're going to mess up my bulletin board, so, you know, I'm not going to give anybody else that opportunity. Or maybe I've been in charge of an activity for years, And one year they asked somebody else to do it. How does that make me feel? Do I get mad and say, well, I'm not going to participate. They didn't appreciate my efforts. Or do we give somebody else an opportunity to grow and to learn? And this is where it really gets sticky and can get ugly. And a lot of you in here are preachers' wives and elders' wives, and so you're at risk more. But it can happen to any of us. You know, the Smiths are shunning my family because my husband has taught something biblical that they don't agree with. And they get mad, and they treat my family ugly. They treat my kids ugly. My kids had nothing to do with it. How do I respond to that? You know, it's my nature. It's not my nature. It's human nature to want to show them, you know, I'm going to let them know how mad I am, and I'm not going to talk to them, and I'm not going to be around them. And some maybe even go so far as to plot revenge. But this is a natural reaction, but is it the right reaction? You know, I think we get kind of hung up in reactions sometimes when instead we need responses, not just that quick, spur-of-the-moment reaction. My thought process toward those people should be, how can I fix this? How can I make things better between us? Not that you go back on what's correct biblically, but how do I endear them to me and to the gospel again? I read a thought about Jesus that I think beautifully illustrates the right kind of thinking, lovely thinking. And it went like this. Jesus treated Judas so well that none of his disciples were able to detect that it was Judas who would betray him. I want to read that again because I want that to sink in. I think this is really good. Jesus treated Judas so well that none of his disciples were able to detect that it was Judas who would betray him. That's a true example of loving your enemies. That kind of action towards somebody who has hurt you stems from thinking on things that are lovely. That didn't happen just spur of the moment. It took time to build that. Living your life, not dwelling on lovely things or any of those things listed in Philippians 4:8 results in a life full of anxiety. It's a life without peace and without joy. It's a life of discontent. And nobody wants that kind of life, but how many of us choose it just day after day after day? It's a conscious decision to live differently. And Paul gives us the formula. You ready for the secret to a happy life? I've got it right here. If you want to have peace and contentment in your life, here it is. It's in Philippians 4. Philippians 4:6 says to pray right. Philippians 4:8 says to think right. And Philippians 4:9 says to do right. Once again, easy stuff to say, easy to understand, but much harder to do. So let's see if we can make it doable. How do I think on whatsoever is lovely and thereby live a lovely life? Worry is a huge factor in not being able to think right or in a lovely way. And Paul says we're not supposed to do it. So how do we overcome that? Instead, he says we are to be given to prayer and supplication. Now, prayer is a general term. We all understand that concept. Supplication involves begging and pleading. Have you ever been so upset over something that when you go to God, you're just begging him for his help? That should bring you peace. Are you still going to have concerns? Yes, of course. But you know that you can trust in God to take care of it. And it may not be that it gets resolved in this life, but remember that promised land. That's where it's going to be taken care of. God's promised it to you, Romans 8:28. Romans 8:35 through 39 reads, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are killed all day long. We are accounted as sheep for slaughter. Yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created things shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in our Lord, Christ Jesus." God is on your side. And we don't suffer near the things that they were talking about in that verse. But what better thought is there than that, to know that he's with you? Take note that our prayers require thanksgiving as well. Philippians 4:6 reads, "But in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." Gratitude plays a huge role in lovely thinking, and I think it's really at the root of a lovely mindset. And who is more deserving of our gratitude than God? We need to be praying with thanksgiving to him. And you know, saying thank you and writing thank you notes, that's almost become a lost art in society, hasn't it? Being thankful is something that takes practice. It's kind of like your muscles. You know, if you don't work out those muscles, they get weak. Well, you have a thankful muscle, and you need to work it out. And one way to do this is to try writing down the things that you're thankful for on a daily basis. This will change your thinking. It will revolutionize your thinking. Instead of being focused on all your problems and your difficulties, you start seeing the blessings even inside of those difficulties. You change the way you look at things, and the things you look at change. Now, I found a list of common complaints, things that we can all relate to, but there's a blessing inside each one of them. What about having to get up early and get the kids off to school? That's a drudgery sometimes, isn't it? But then you have children that you love. A house to clean means you have a safe place to live. Dirty laundry, you have clothes to wear. Dishes to wash, you got food to eat. This is the one that gets me, grocery shopping. You've got money to provide for you. There are crumbs under your table, you have a family to eat with. You got toilets to clean, and this is kind of far removed from us these days, but you have indoor plumbing. There's lots of noise and busyness in your life. There are people in your life who need you. There are endless questions about homework. Your kids' brains are growing, and you're sore and you're tired in the bed, but you're still alive. We need to be praying with thanksgiving. Now, Paul also tells us that we need to think right, and he gives us a whole list of those things in verse 8. But again, our focus is the lovely. So what kinds of things do you fill your mind with? Do you spend time studying the Word of God? Not just on Sunday morning, but through your week? You will gain more courage, more inspiration, more assurance, and more encouragement from his Word than anywhere else. You know, you're reading about real men and women who made mistakes and went through struggles just like we do, and it helps you to know you're not alone. The Psalms can help you focus, especially in the realm of thanksgiving. You want to learn how to pray with thanksgiving? Read the Psalms. Proverbs gives good practical advice. God's plan for redeeming man is found all woven through the scriptures, and there's so much advice on good godly living found in the epistles. It's no wonder the Bible's the best-selling book of all time. Yeah, how often do we take it and we lay it down on the table when we come in the door from services, and we don't pick it up again until it's time to go back to services? I think we need to consider, too, what we fill our minds with from a secular perspective. You know, we don't live in a bubble with our Bibles. 2 years ago, I stood in this room facing what had been the biggest challenge of my life, and my parents, both of whom were terminally ill, were preparing to move to Mississippi to be closer to my sister and me. And they moved here in July of 2017. And my mom had ALS, and she could no longer walk. And my dad was sick with cancer, and he was the kind of man who really depended on his wife very heavily. My mom's disease had affected her mind, and she was no longer the person that we had grown up with. I began caring for them and doing what I could, and it was hard. And I know a lot of you in here know that caretaker role, and it's hard. And it's in times like that, lovely thoughts are really hard to hold on to. So I had to start looking for some ways to hold on mentally and emotionally. I had to quit watching the news because it was just too depressing. And I started, when I could, to watch a lot more Little House on the Prairie. I wrote to a friend who she's always helped me to think more positively. And one of her suggestions was to read the Anne of Green Gables books. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with those stories, but Anne is a girl who had lots of problems in her life, but she had this bright, sunny disposition, and she always made the best out of things. That's encouraging when you're struggling, to have that kind of happy outcome to listen to. And I didn't have time to read by any chance at that point in time, but I'd listen to them in the car as I would go back and forth to the facility where my parents lived. When you're going through bad things, bad times, you need to surround yourself with things that will uplift you. You know, you need to post your favorite quotes or favorite scriptures around the house. This is the time to get out those CDs from lectureships or your PTP drive or whatever it is and listen to those things. Cut out the things that bring you down as much as you can. And really, this is good advice, not just when you're going through bad times, but all the time. On one of my mom's better days, she asked me to do a Bible marking with her. And bless her heart, she could hardly follow along, and she could hardly turn the pages. But she wanted to do this, and she wanted to study the death for a Christian. She was looking for the assurance that God gives for his children, and she wanted to dwell on whatsoever things are lovely. And this is the loveliest, isn't it? To think about your home in heaven, your citizenship in eternity. It doesn't get any better than that. You want to read Philippians through, and you'll see that's exactly what Paul is doing. That's what he's facing, is death. And so he's looking for that same thing, that assurance in eternity. When you're facing death or the death of a loved one, it's a great comfort to think about heaven. There's no more pain, there's no more sorrow, there's no more death. Fill your mind with scripture, with positive ideas, and with thoughts of heaven. In my office at home, I have a sign hanging up, and it's a quote by Roald Dahl, and it's one of my favorites. It says, "Think happy thoughts, and they will shine out of your face like sunbeams, and you will always look lovely." Who we spend our time with also makes a difference in our thinking. You know the saying, lay down with dogs and you're going to get fleas? And the Bible puts it more eloquently in Proverbs 27:17, iron sharpeneth iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend. I know you've all gone to visit somebody to encourage them, and who comes away encouraged? You do. But we all also have that friend that we go to who helps us see just how badly we've been mistreated and how hard life is. And sometimes that's just the friend we're looking for, isn't it? Somebody to help us have a little pity party and feel justified in our feelings. Spend time with the people who lift you up, and then be that person for others. How we spend our time also affects our thinking. An idle mind is the devil's workshop. Having too much time on our hands feeds negative thinking. And we start to think things like, nobody likes me, they don't ever include me, I feel left out. An idle mind devises wicked imaginings, and it sometimes plots revenge. An idle mind has time to think about everything that's wrong in the world. It compares itself to others, and it will rob you of joy. Lovely thinking requires not only prayer with thanksgiving and study and dwelling on the good, but it requires doing good. Philippians 4:9 says, "Those things which ye have both learned and received and heard and seen in me, do, and the God of peace shall be with you." Pray, think, and do. There's your formula. Lovely thinking requires service. It says, how can I help? What can I do today to encourage? What can I do to help myself be better today? Think about Dorcas. You know, she spent her time caring for the widows, and she was making them clothes. Was she a widow? Maybe. Was she an empty nester? That's where I'm at in life. I find I have more time on my hands. Did she have no family of her own at all? The Bible doesn't really say, but she did have time on her hands, and she used that time in the service of others. Her mind thought about, what can I do for somebody else? And she filled her time doing that. I suspect that sewing was her pleasure. She enjoyed sewing. That was her hobby. And she found a way to bless others with it. So if you've got a hobby, use it that way. Do something with it to encourage others. And you know, she endeared herself to so many people. Think about when she died, how many people came and said, look what she made me, look what she made me. She was loved. Jesus, of course, is the greatest example of service in John 13. Verse 1 tells us that Jesus knew his hour had come. Death was quickly approaching, and he gathered with his loved ones, with his apostles. Now, oftentimes when we're facing something difficult, we have a tendency to shut ourselves down and shut ourselves in and away from people. But he gathered with the people he loved. And after the meal, Jesus took a towel and he filled a basin with water, and he began to wash their feet. And this is so contrary to what we usually do. But here he is, the Son of God, and he's facing death on top of that. And what's he thinking about? What he can do for somebody else. And incidentally, he's teaching them at the same time. I think this is where doing right comes into play. We can serve others, and we can serve him anytime and anywhere. Jesus did it because he had come from God, and he was going to God. John 13:3. And shouldn't that be said about us? We came from God, and we're going to God. This is lovely thinking in action. When I was preparing this lesson, my daughter suggested that I list some scriptures that could help us with lovely thinking when we're going through those difficult times and we need a little extra help. Now, these are not exhaustive lists, but it's a place to start, and they are in the book if if I go too fast. But when you are facing trying times, you might want to use these verses. Joshua 1:9, Psalm 34:17-19, Psalm 41:10, Psalm 49:14-16, Romans 8:26-28, Romans 8:35-39, and Revelation 2:10. And that's a good list of comfort scriptures. When you're facing difficult people, you might want to look at these scriptures. Romans 12:9-21. Luke 6:27-36. 1 Peter 2:21-24. 1 Peter 3:9. And Philippians 2:3-5. When you're facing death, you might want to use these verses. Psalm 116:15. Isaiah 57:1-2. John 11:25-26. 1 Corinthians 15:54-58. Revelation 14:13. And Revelation 2:10. And that list comes from the Bible marking the death of a Christian. That's Kathy Pollard's list, and you can find it on comefillyourcup.com if you want to get the entire list. As we finish up, I want to leave you with one last lovely thought to think on. I find I like to close lessons with hymns from our songbooks. I think they mean a lot more to us the next time we sing them because we spend a little time studying it, and it's actually a pretty good source of lovely thinking as well. Though I through the valley of shadow, or mountain or troubled sea, and oft in the darkness have traveled, the Lord has been mindful of me. Much more than my grief and my sorrow, much more than adversity, much more than the all I have been given, the Lord has been mindful of me. I'm rich, I am saved, I am happy, I've health and prosperity, I've friends, I've doors ever open, the Lord has been mindful of me. The Lord has been mindful of me. He blesses and blesses again. My God is the God of the living. How excellent is his name. Thank you. That was a great